Most people think the unconscious is only the part of themselves they cannot see. Carl Jung understood something far more unsettling than that. The unconscious is not simply hidden emotion or forgotten memory. It is an active force shaping perception long before conscious thought begins interpreting reality. You may believe you are deciding how to see the world, while entire layers of your reactions were already moving beneath awareness before the decision ever reached language. This is why two people can experience the same event and walk away carrying entirely different realities inside themselves. You can notice this pattern in ordinary life once you begin paying attention carefully enough. One person enters a room and immediately feels threatened, while another feels welcomed. One hears criticism in a neutral sentence, while another hears concern. The event itself matters less than the internal architecture already interpreting it. Jung saw that human beings do not simply encounter reality directly. They encounter reality through symbolic structures, emotional residue, memory patterns, inherited assumptions, and unconscious associations that silently organize perception before thought arrives to explain what already happened. This changes the way you understand identity itself. Most people think identity is something they consciously build through preferences, beliefs, and experiences. But identity is also constructed through repeated emotional patterns that become invisible through familiarity. A person may spend years believing they are simply cautious, when fear has actually become part of the structure through which they interpret life. Another may believe they are independent, while unconsciously organizing their entire personality around avoiding vulnerability. The unconscious often disguises adaptation as authenticity. That is why self knowledge becomes more difficult the longer a pattern remains unexamined. The mind normalizes whatever repeats often enough. Eventually, the person no longer experiences the pattern as a pattern, they experience it as reality itself. Jung recognized that much of psychological suffering comes from confusing conditioned perception with objective truth. People rarely defend reality as aggressively as they defend the version of reality their identity depends upon remaining intact. You begin noticing something important once this becomes visible. The unconscious does not only hide pain, it also hides potential. Many people assume the deeper mind only contains trauma, repression, fear, or instability. But the same unconscious field also contains unrealized creativity, undeveloped intelligence, emotional depth, intuition, symbolic understanding, and entire capacities of being that consciousness has not yet integrated. The hidden self is not only dangerous territory, it is unfinished territory. This is why periods of confusion sometimes precede expansion. A person begins questioning old assumptions and suddenly feels unstable, uncertain, emotionally exposed, or psychologically disoriented. Most people immediately try to restore the previous structure because uncertainty feels threatening to the nervous system. But Jung understood that confusion is sometimes evidence that the psyche is reorganizing itself beyond an outdated identity pattern. The discomfort is not always collapse. Sometimes it is reconstruction occurring before the conscious mind fully understands what is changing. You can see this mechanism clearly in major life transition. A relationship ends and the person says they lost themselves. A career dissolves and suddenly they no longer know who they are. A belief system fractures and reality feels strangely unfamiliar for months or even years afterward. What is actually happening in many of these moments is that an unconscious organizing structure has stopped functioning. The psyche temporarily loses the symbolic map it was using to orient experience. Until a new structure forms, the individual often feels psychologically suspended between identities. Most people rush to fill that emptiness immediately. They search for new labels, new ideologies, new communities, new certainty, or new identities because ambiguity feels unbearable when the internal map dissolves. But Jung repeatedly pointed towards something deeper than immediate replacement. He understood that growth requires tolerating periods where the old structure no longer works while the new structure has not fully emerged. This is one reason transformation feels lonely even when other people surround you. The internal architecture changes before external language can fully describe what is happening. You may notice that modern culture often works against this process entirely. People are encouraged to perform certainty constantly. Every emotion must be quickly categorized. Every experience must become content. Every identity must become publicly defined and defended. But the psyche does not naturally evolve at the speed of social performance. Real psychological development often happens slowly, quietly, and beneath visible behavior long before the individual can clearly articulate what is changing inside them. This is where Jung's understanding of symbols becomes important. He did not treat symbols as decorative mythology or abstract philosophy. He saw them as communication bridges between conscious awareness and deeper psychological structures. Dreams, recurring images, emotional themes, repeated relationship dynamics, and strange moments of recognition all function as symbolic language emerging from levels of mind deeper than ordinary reasoning. The unconscious often speaks through pattern before it speaks through explanation. This is also why certain stories affect human beings across generations, regardless of culture or time period. People do not emotionally respond only to the surface narrative. They respond to deeper symbolic movements embedded within the story itself. The abandoned child, the wise elder, the descent into darkness, the return from suffering, the hidden double, the confrontation with shadow, the rebirth after collapse. These patterns appear repeatedly because they reflect recurring structures within human psychological development itself. Jung recognized that mythology was not primitive superstition. It was encoded psychological observation. Once you begin seeing life this way, your relationship to suffering changes. This does not mean pain suddenly becomes pleasant or easy. It means suffering is no longer interpreted only as meaningless punishment. Sometimes emotional pain reveals conflict between the life someone consciously performs and the deeper truth their psyche can no longer suppress. Anxiety can emerge when a person spends too long violating their own emotional reality. Depression can sometimes appear when large portions of the self have been abandoned in exchange for social adaptation. The unconscious eventually forces attention toward what consciousness refuses to acknowledge voluntarily. This becomes visible in smaller ways long before crisis arrives. A person repeatedly sabotages relationships they consciously claim to want. Another continuously postpones meaningful work while insisting they are waiting for the perfect moment. Someone else becomes intensely reactive when certain topics appear, even when the external situation does not justify the emotional intensity involved. Jung understood that exaggerated reactions often reveal unconscious material attempting to surface into awareness. The reaction is not random, it is pressure leaking through the psychological structure. The difficult part is that confronting unconscious material rarely feels flattering at first. Most people imagine self awareness as discovering hidden greatness inside themselves. Sometimes it begins there, but often it begins by realizing how much of your behavior was organized around fear, validation, control, avoidance, resentment, insecurity, or emotional compensation. This is why genuine self observation requires unusual honesty. The ego prefers explanations that preserve innocence. The unconscious reveals motivations that are often far more complicated than the conscious self initially wants to admit. But this honesty eventually creates a different kind of freedom. When unconscious patterns remain invisible, people unconsciously obey them while believing they are acting freely. The person who fears abandonment may unknowingly shape every relationship around preventing rejection. The person addicted to validation may organize their entire personality around being perceived correctly. The person terrified of uncertainty may mistake control for wisdom. Awareness does not erase these tendencies instantly, but it interrupts automatic identification with them. You start realizing that maturity is not becoming flawless. It is becoming increasingly conscious of the forces moving within you before they completely control your behavior. Jung was not trying to create perfect human beings. He was trying to help people become integrated human beings. Integration means learning to recognize contradiction without fragmenting psychologically. It means understanding that intelligence and irrationality can coexist inside the same person. Strength and fear can coexist. Compassion and anger can coexist. The human psyche is larger and less tidy than most identities allow themselves to admit. That realization changes the way you see other people, too. Once you recognize how much unconscious structure exists within yourself, it becomes harder to maintain simplistic judgments about everyone else. You begin understanding that many human conflicts are not only intellectual disagreements, they are collisions between invisible emotional architectures people themselves barely understand. Much of what society calls certainty is often unconscious fear attempting to stabilize identity through rigid belief. And once that becomes visible, another question quietly begins emerging beneath the surface of everything Jung explored. If so much of human life is shaped by forces operating beneath ordinary awareness, then consciousness itself may not be nearly as unified as people assume when they first begin looking inward. If consciousness is not as unified as it first appears, then self-knowledge cannot remain a surface activity. It is not enough to ask what you believe, what you want, or what kind of person you think you are. Those questions matter, but they often reach only the conscious layer that has already learned how to explain itself. Jung moves the inquiry deeper by showing that a person is not one voice inside a body. A person is an inner field of competing impulses, inherited images, buried fears, unlived potentials, and symbolic patterns, all trying to participate in the formation of a life. This does not mean the self is broken. It means the self is layered. The problem begins when one layer pretends it is the whole person. The conscious identity says, "This is who I am," while the shadow quietly carries everything that had to be rejected for that identity to survive. The person may appear consistent on the outside, but inside them there are abandoned qualities still seeking expression. What is not integrated does not disappear. It returns as projection, compulsion, resentment, attraction, fear, or fate. This is why Jung's concept of the shadow matters so much. The shadow is not simply evil, and reducing it to darkness misses the teaching. The shadow is whatever the conscious personality refuses to recognize as part of itself. For one person, that may be anger. For another, tenderness. For another, ambition, grief, sexuality, vulnerability, confidence, selfishness, brilliance, dependency, or power. The shadow forms wherever the living self has been divided into what is acceptable and what must be hidden. You can recognize shadow by the intensity of your reactions. When another person's behavior creates a response in you that feels larger than the situation itself, something deeper has usually been touched. Sometimes you are reacting to a real issue, but the size of the emotional charge reveals that the issue is carrying old material. You may condemn someone for arrogance while secretly fearing your own desire to be seen. You may despise weakness because you have exiled your own need for care. You may mock intensity because your own fire was punished before it could mature. Projection is the mechanism that keeps shadow hidden while still allowing it to act. Instead of experiencing a rejected quality as part of ourselves, we locate it in someone else. This creates the illusion that the problem is entirely outside us. The mind then feels morally justified in attacking, avoiding, worshiping, or obsessing over what it refuses to claim inwardly. Jung saw projection not as a rare mistake, but as one of the ordinary ways human beings avoid psychological responsibility. Until projection is withdrawn, people keep fighting mirrors while believing they are fighting reality. This changes how you understand attraction as well as aversion. The shadow does not only appear in what irritates you, it can appear in what fascinates you. Sometimes a person becomes enchanted by someone who carries a quality they have not yet allowed themselves to embody. They may call it admiration, love, destiny, or inspiration, and sometimes it is those things. But beneath the surface, the psyche may also be pointing toward an unlit possibility. What you place on a pedestal may be part of yourself returning in disguised form. This is not a reason to become suspicious of every feeling. It is a reason to become more precise. Jung invites a kind of inner listening that does not immediately believe or dismiss emotional intensity. Instead, it asks what the intensity is carrying, what image is being activated, what lost part of the self is trying to speak through this encounter, what old wound is dressing itself as certainty, what future capacity is arriving first as longing. When the question deepens, the experience becomes more useful than the immediate reaction. The implication is practical and demanding. If shadow remains unconscious, it does not stay private. It shapes relationships, communities, spiritual movements, families, and entire cultures. A group can project its rejected qualities onto another group and call the projection truth. A society can disown its violence and then describe the people it harms as dangerous. A spiritual person can reject their ego publicly while privately becoming controlled by the need to be seen as egoless. Shadow does not disappear because language becomes refined. It often hides better. This is why Jung's work is so necessary inside spiritual spaces. Any path that speaks of light without developing a mature relationship to shadow becomes vulnerable to distortion. People learn the language of transcendence while leaving their unconscious motives untouched. They call avoidance peace. They call disassociation surrender. They call superiority discernment. They call emotional repression maturity. The outer vocabulary becomes luminous while the inner structure remains unexamined. Jung interrupts that by insisting that wholeness is not the same as purity. Wholeness requires the courage to include what the preferred self would rather exclude. This does not mean acting out every impulse or glorifying every hidden quality. Integration is not indulgence, it is conscious relationship. Anger, when unconscious, can become cruelty or sabotage. Anger, when integrated, can become boundary, courage, and truth. Vulnerability, when unconscious, can become dependency or manipulation. Vulnerability, when integrated, becomes intimacy, honesty, and receptivity. The same energy changes expression depending on the level of consciousness holding it. This is where the spiral perspective begins to recognize Jung as a cartographer of inner integration. He does not merely describe psychological contents, he reveals how fragmented contents seek relationship. The psyche is not trying to become flawless. It is trying to become whole enough that energy no longer needs to distort itself in order to be expressed. When a rejected part is recognized, it can return with less violence. When it is denied, it must speak through symptom, projection, or fate. You may notice this in moments when a recurrent pattern finally becomes visible. At first, there can be embarrassment because the mind realizes it has been repeating something it thought it had already outgrown. Then there can be grief because you see how long the pattern has shaped your choices. But after grief, there is often relief. The pattern is no longer invisible. What is seen can begin to change relationship to the whole. Awareness does not erase the pattern instantly, but it removes its absolute authority. This is the deeper meaning of individuation. It is not becoming more eccentric, more special, or more separate from others. Individuation is the process of becoming inwardly undivided enough to live from the center rather than from the demands of fragmented parts. It is not the ego becoming stronger in its own isolation. It is the ego learning its proper place within a larger totality of self. The person becomes less possessed by partial identities because they begin forming relationship with the deeper organizing center beneath them. That center is not easily described because it is not merely a thought about identity. Jung called it the self, not in the shallow sense of personality, but as the deeper wholeness around which the psyche organizes development. The ego is necessary, but it is not the whole. When the ego thinks it is everything, life becomes defensive and narrow. When the ego begins relating to the deeper self, life becomes more symbolic, more guided, more responsive to patterns that exceed immediate preference. The person begins sensing that their life is not just a sequence of events, but a process of becoming conscious. This does not make life easier in a simple way. It often makes life more honest. Dreams become less random. Reactions become more revealing. Relationships become more instructive. Repeated disappointments begin to show structure. Inner conflict becomes material rather than evidence of failure. The person stops asking only how to get rid of discomfort and begins asking what the discomfort is trying to reveal. That shift is one of the clearest signs of psychological maturation. The collective implication is just as important as the personal one. A culture that refuses shadow becomes dangerous because it must keep finding enemies to carry what it cannot admit about itself. It will locate greed, violence, irrationality, corruption, or spiritual emptiness somewhere outside its own mirror. Then it will feel righteous while projecting its disowned material onto others. Jung understood that collective shadow can become history when enough people refuse inner work. What remains unconscious in individuals eventually organizes itself through groups, institutions, and nations. This is why inner work is not merely private. It changes the quality of what a person brings into the world. Someone who has met their own shadow is less easily seduced by mass projection. They are harder to recruit into simplistic hatred because they understand how easily the human mind assigns its own disowned content to a target. They can still recognize injustice, harm, and deception, but they do so with cleaner perception. Their discernment becomes less contaminated by the need to prove themselves innocent. And once the shadow is understood this way, Jung's teachings open into something larger than psychology. It becomes a map of how consciousness learns to stop dividing itself against itself. The inner world becomes a living landscape where symbols, reactions, dreams, and relationships all reveal different parts of the same unfinished movement toward wholeness. The person who enters this work seriously does not become less human. They become more fully human because they no longer need to amputate parts of themselves in order to maintain a presentable identity. The next question then becomes even more subtle. If the unconscious speaks through symbols, projections, dreams, reactions, and recurring patterns, then life itself may be communicating with the psyche in a language far older than ordinary thought. Jung does not allow the listener to remain at the surface of personal psychology for long, because eventually the inner world begins resembling a symbolic universe, and the boundary between private mind and larger reality starts becoming less certain than it once seemed. If life itself begins to look symbolic, then Jung is no longer only speaking about dreams. He is speaking about the hidden grammar of experience. A dream shows the psyche in images while the body sleeps, but waking life can also arrange itself in patterns the conscious mind does not immediately understand. A repeated encounter, a sudden attraction, an old fear returning through a new situation, a strange coincidence that feels charged with meaning. These are not automatically messages from beyond, but they are not automatically meaningless either. Jung teaches the listener to stay with meaning before rushing to belief or dismissal. This is one of the reasons his work remains difficult to place inside ordinary categories. He is too psychological to be dismissed as mystical, but too symbolic to be contained by shallow psychology. He understands that the psyche does not live in a flat world made only of logic, cause, and visible behavior. Human beings experience reality through meaning, and meaning behaves differently than information. Information can be stored. Meaning reorganizes the person who receives it. That is why one image, one dream, one encounter, or one sentence can change the direction of an entire life. Jung's idea of synchronicity becomes important here, not because it proves every coincidence is sacred, but because it challenges the assumption that meaning is only projected onto reality after the fact. Sometimes an outer event and an inner state align so precisely that the experience feels more like correspondence than accident. The rational mind may not know what to do with that because it has been trained to accept only mechanical causality. But the psyche recognizes another kind of order, an order in which timing, symbol, and inner readiness converge. Jung does not ask the listener to abandon reason. He asks reason to become large enough to include meaningful pattern. You may notice this in your own life when a certain theme keeps returning through unrelated circumstances. You are thinking about an old wound, and then a conversation exposes the same pattern. You are avoiding a choice, and life seems to keep placing the same decision before you in different forms. You are beginning to outgrow an identity, and suddenly books, dreams, memories, relationships, and discomfort all begin pointing toward the same threshold. The literal mind says these are separate incidents. The symbolic mind asks why they are gathering around the same center. This does not mean the world revolves around the ego. That misunderstanding is dangerous because it turns symbolic perception into narcissism. Jung's teaching requires humility precisely because it suggests that meaning is not always created by the conscious self. Sometimes the ego is not the author of the pattern, but the one being instructed by it. This is a major reversal in perspective. The ego wants to interpret life from above. The deeper psyche often teaches from below, around, behind, and within, using experiences the ego did not choose and cannot fully control. That is why symbolic life can feel both intimate and humbling. Intimate because the events seem to touch the exact place inside you that needs to awaken. Humbling because you realize your conscious plans are not the only intelligence moving through your life. Jung opens the possibility that the psyche belongs to a larger field of meaning than the personal mind can command. This does not make personal responsibility disappear, it deepens it. You become responsible not only for what you choose, but for how honestly you listen to what life keeps revealing. Dreams become one of the clearest training grounds for this listening. A dream does not usually speak in the direct language of the waking ego. It dramatizes relationships between inner forces. A house may become the self. A stranger may become an unrecognized aspect of personality. Water may carry feeling. Darkness may hold what has not yet become consciousness. A journey may reveal a transition the waking mind has not admitted is underway. Jung understood that dreams are not random debris. They are symbolic compositions that often compensate for the one-sidedness of conscious life. This compensation matters. If someone becomes too identified with control, dreams may bring chaos. If someone becomes too intellectual, dreams may bring emotion, body, animal, or instinct. If someone clings to innocence, dreams may introduce shadow. If someone believes they are powerless, dreams may reveal force or hidden authority. The psyche seeks balance, and dreams often reveal what conscious identity excludes. They do not always confirm who you think you are. Often they reveal what your self-image is failing to include. This is why dream work requires patience. The first interpretation is often the ego trying to make the dream harmless. The deeper meaning usually appears when the dream is allowed to remain alive rather than being translated too quickly. Jung's method asks the listener to circle the image, to amplify it, to ask what it evokes, what pattern it belongs to, what emotional charge it carries, and where similar images appear in myth, memory, or life. The dream is not solved like a riddle. It is entered like a room. The meaning unfolds as relationship deepens. The implication of this is profound for anyone seeking wholeness. Your psyche may be communicating with you constantly, but not in the language your conscious mind prefers. If you only listen for explanations, you may miss symbols. If you only listen for comfort, you may miss correction. If you only listen for certainty, you may miss invitation. Jung teaches that the inner life is not silent. It is often we who are undertrained in the languages it uses. This same symbolic intelligence appears in archetypes. Archetypes are not merely characters from old stories. They are deep, organizing patterns that shape human experience across cultures and eras. The mother, the father, the hero, the trickster, the wise elder, the shadow, the child, the healer, the destroyer, the guide. These figures recur because they express structural possibilities within the psyche. When an archetype activates, a person can feel taken over by a larger pattern. They may become heroic, devouring, prophetic, seductive, rebellious, sacrificial, or tyrannical without realizing that an old form is moving through their individual life. This helps explain why certain moments feel bigger than personal psychology. Falling in love can activate archetypal projection, making another person appear larger, brighter, more destined than ordinary perception would allow. Entering conflict can activate the warrior or the victim. Beginning a creative life can awaken the child, the magician, the rebel, or the builder. Facing loss can draw the psyche into descent, where old myths of death and renewal begin playing through ordinary grief. Jung saw that human beings do not simply have experiences. They are often entered by patterns larger than themselves. The danger is possession by the archetype. When a person identifies completely with an archetypal force, they lose proportion. The healer begins needing to heal everyone. The prophet begins needing to be obeyed. The victim begins seeing every challenge as persecution. The rebel cannot stop opposing even when opposition is no longer wise. The love cannot distinguish intimacy from projection. Integration requires recognizing the archetypal energy without becoming swallowed by it. The pattern can serve life only when the ego remains in conscious relationship to it. This is where Jung's work becomes essential for spiritual creators, teachers, and seekers. When symbolic energy increases, so does the risk of inflation. The person touches something larger than the personal self and begins believing they personally are the largeness. They confuse contact with possession, insight with superiority, calling with exemption from humility. Jung warned about this with unusual seriousness because he understood the psyche's hunger for significance. The encounter with the deep must be balanced by grounding, ethics, humor, relationship, and ordinary responsibility. Without these, spiritual language can become a mask for unconscious inflation. The spiral perspective receives this as a necessary correction. Expansion without integration becomes distortion. Symbolic vision without shadow work becomes fantasy. Contact with archetypal force without humility becomes performance. The inner world is real enough to transform a life, but not every image should be obeyed literally. Not every intensity is guidance. Not every synchronicity is instruction. Discernment is the difference between being opened by meaning and being consumed by interpretation. Jung's greatness is that he gives permission to take the inner world seriously without abandoning psychological responsibility. He does not flatten dreams into nonsense, but he also does not turn every symbol into a command. He does not dismiss myth as primitive, but he also understands how myth can possess a person who lacks self-awareness. He does not reduce spirituality to pathology, yet he refuses to let spirituality bypass the shadow. This balance is rare because it honors depth without surrendering clarity. As this teaching settles, the listener begins to understand that the psyche is not a small private chamber hidden inside the skull. It is a threshold space where a personal memory, collective pattern, symbolic intelligence, and lived reality meet. To work with the psyche is to work with a living system of meaning. This system does not reveal itself all at once. It reveals itself through dreams, reactions, images, relationships, repetitions, and the strange feeling that some events carry more significance than their surface should allow. That realization changes how you walk through life. You become slower to dismiss what moves you deeply. You become more careful with what you project onto others. You become more willing to ask what a repeated pattern is asking you to see. You become less eager to call every inner conflict failure because you begin recognizing conflict as the psyche's way of revealing unfinished relationship between parts of the self. A life becomes more readable, not because everything has a fixed meaning, but because you have become more capable of listening before naming. Maybe this is the quiet power of Jung's place within the lineage. He teaches that awakening does not only move upward into light or outward into cosmic structure. It also moves inward into the symbolic depths where the self has been divided, disguised, and waiting. He reminds the listener that the path to wholeness does not bypass dream, shadow, myth, projection, or unconscious pattern. The passes through them with patience. And once that passage begins, the question is no longer simply what do I believe, but what within me is trying to become conscious through the life I am already living.
If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Vaharat library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.